You know how I'm always talking about ERGs getting involved in policy review, policy change, etc. Well, what if you spend weeks and weeks or even months working on some ideas for policy and they don't get approved? So I had a conversation with somebody last week where that exact thing happened. So and by coincidence, I'm also reading No Rules Rules about the Netflix culture, and I wanted to just reflect on some of the learnings and see whether they would be useful here and maybe why they won't be useful. So this is ERG Strategy, the channel that brings you tips, tools, advice, etc. If you want to maintain engaged, impactful employee networks that make a difference in your workplace. New videos every week, every Tuesday, and I go live on LinkedIn on Friday mornings at 8:30 a.m. UK time. So let's get into this then. So yeah, I had a conversation with somebody, it was either last week or the week before, and basically they had been working on policy change. I can't even remember which people policy it was. I'm going to say, here's what it was. It was about paid leave. It was about, making the HR policy more flexible such that if somebody wanted to use leave for other things, not the sort of like religious bank holidays that we have in the UK. So if they wanted to maybe like save those, say, Easter bank holidays to instead use for Eid, for example, that they could do that. So they'd worked on this policy, got all the way to the board. Their people director was in support, etc. Got knocked back at the last minute. And as I had this call with her, I was like, I literally said to her, I said, I'm going to do a video about that because I thought, let me get into the specifics of it, because here I am always saying to employee networks, you need to get involved in like reviewing policy and recommending improvements and all of that. And I don't think I've ever really talked about the how. I don't really think I've talked about that. And I've got more people that are asking me to do videos about creating business case and all of that. So if that is something that you want, if you want more of the how on some of these things, please put it in the comments and I will do more of that. So what I'm going to do for this video then, as I said to you, I have been reading No Rules Rules about the Netflix culture. It's a great book, first of all. The reason I'm reading this, two reasons. First of all, I'm onboarding a new client. And whenever I'm onboarding a new client, I either refer back into my existing books and research and things like that, or I supplement it with new books, right? And I'm going to be working on culture and ways of doing things. So that's why I picked this book up. In fact, I picked this book up after reading The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. This book, No Rules Rules, is by Erin Meyer and Reed Hastings, the co-founder of Netflix. So that's why I picked this book up. And in this book, there is a chapter which is about no approval decisions. So decision making when no approval is made, but there are kind of like rules around it. And so I was like, okay, how many of those rules would apply if, for example, there's an ERG, and I know Netflix has ERG. So if there's an ERG wanting to make policy change, how much of those rules could work? As opposed to my own book here, which I don't talk about very often, but my own book, Smashing Stereotypes, How to Get Ahead When You're the Only Blank in the Room. In this book, I talk about how to get board approval for anything, right? And so I'm going to like compare and contrast which of the pieces of advice are going to be most useful for you if you are trying to get policy change specifically, but actually it kind of probably works for anything, to be honest. So let's start with the rules, the guidance, the guiding principles, is that what they call them, in the No Rules Rules. So in the Netflix culture, there are basically 4 steps to take to make a decision, a good decision where you don't need rules. I turned the page and it went to it straight away. That shows you how much I've actually been reading this book. I'm actually listening on audiobook, but I buy the physical book as well so I can thumb through and use it for reference for moments like this. So the Netflix approach then, right, to making good decisions, and let's see what works in terms of getting ERG policy changes through, right? So the first one is farm for dissent, as in like go looking for dissent or socialize your ideas. Now, to me, that absolutely works for when you're trying to make policy change. You need to go looking for people that don't think it's a good idea. And that's something that I also talk about in my book as well. You need to go looking for different ideas, maybe research that suggests that your idea isn't right. So go looking for the data, etc. So that's the first thing that you need to do. You need to look for maybe why it's not a good idea as the first thing. The second step in the Netflix rules are, if it's a big idea, test it out, which I think is kind of useful. You know, if it's if you're suggesting like a massive change, is there a way that it can be piloted, or there can be a proof of concept, or it can be rolled out in a small way, maybe to like one particular business area or one market or region. So that's the second Netflix rule. So I think that kind of applies. The third step is, as the informed captain, right? So at Netflix, it's kind of like devolved decision making, right? So the Netflix third step is place your bet. So basically, it's kind of like, you know, just pick what you want to do now. I'm not sure you can necessarily do that as an ERG. I guess the ERG version of that might be, what's your recommended option, right? So what's the one option? Now that you've done the testing, you've got some feedback, you've looked for evidence that disproves what you first thought, what's your recommended option? And then you just do it. So the Netflix kind of, it almost stops there. There's one more step, but it almost stops there, because the Netflix way of doing it is just do it, like JFDI. So mate, just do it, mate. The fourth step is, if it wins, celebrate it. If it fails, sunshine it, as in shine a spotlight on it. That's not going to work in most organizations, unless you happen to be in Netflix. And if you are an ERG in Netflix, I'd love to hear from you. But that isn't going to work in most organizations, because in most organizations, especially around things like people policies, that sometimes also butt up against legislation and regulation, and then also custom and culture. There are probably a few more hoops to jump through, right? So when I went and picked up my book this morning, because I thought, right, let me just go back to my own framework and see what I said. When I picked up my book, and I found the chapter where I talk about getting board approval, it actually starts with me finding out that I'd got a job working for the CEO. So in the company that I was in at the time, I got a job working for the CEO. And basically, when I was in that job, and when I found out I was in New York, we used to like going to New York. I'll just leave that there. But we were in New York, and I was walking down Fifth Avenue, and I remember it like it was yesterday, and I got a phone call from the CEO to tell me that I had the job. It was a really nice phone call, and he was a great CEO to work for as well. But basically, in that role, which I did for almost 2 years, I would go to all of the board meetings. And so I learned a lot about how things get done. I learned a lot about how execs operate. That's why I think when I come at this ERG work, and I talk about exec sponsors and what they need and all of those things, it's because I've worked very closely with a lot of execs. First of all, in that role, and then obviously when I was leading sort of like transformation programs, I've worked for a lot of CFOs and CEOs in particular. So that's where my views around what works in terms of getting board approval come into play. It's just what I've seen a lot. Now, it's not science backed, right? There's no research. This is literally just based on what I've seen work. So here are my steps. First of all, work out the room. And when I say work out the room, so I'm specifically talking about a boardroom, but in the situation of like a policy, what I'm basically saying is work out who the decision makers are going to be. Work out who those decision makers are, and then you want to plot them in terms of their impact and their influence, whether it's low or high. Anybody that's on the high influence, that is part of that decision making chain, you want to meet them, as in you want to meet them in person if you can. If you can't, then obviously you're going to have to do it on a Zoom. But ideally, you are actually going to meet them before the point at which they need to give it a yes or a no, right? So that's my first step. My second step is get early feedback. So actually quite similar to the Netflix rules, like get early feedback, right? So socializing, right? That's kind of like my version of that. My third step is find your sponsor. Like, be clear about who your sponsor is going to be when the discussion is happening. So if, for example, it is going to a board or it's going to a particular meeting, it could be the HR senior leadership team meeting, wherever it's going, be clear on who the sponsor is of that idea or that paper when you're going into that meeting. Whether it's your exec sponsor of your ERG, whether it's the people director that's actually going to be the sponsor of that paper. That doesn't mean that they sponsor you in your career. It doesn't mean that they're now your ERG sponsor. They are just sponsoring that particular recommendation, right? And so what that looks like when it's done really well, if you watch the LinkedIn Live video that I did with Michelle Hunter from Indeed Flex, where she went through their incredible case study of how they got approval for a Pride sponsorship and the process to get the business case signed off. We talked about what this looks like, good sponsorship in a room. And I said, talk me through what that good sponsorship looked like in a room, because I've seen that done really well. And I've seen it a lot. My old CEO used to do it. And what it looks like when it's done really well in the actual meeting now, where the decision is going to be made and the information is going to be presented, your sponsor typically opens the discussion by saying, you know, this is such and such, they've come to present X, Y, and Z. I'm fully in support. I'm fully in support. I've seen it, We just need your help with X, Y, and Z. That is what really good sponsorship looks like in that moment of you need a decision making, right? So find who your sponsor is. It may or may not be your exec sponsor for this particular policy review, right? It could be a particular business division head if it's going to impact them more, right? And they're the person that you're going to get on board, and then maybe they're going to be your sponsor, or they're just going to be an ally in the room, right? So finding your sponsor, the person that's going to open the floor to you, endorse it, you know, etc., is really critical. And then my fourth pointer in the book was finding your objectors. So finding who objects and going and having a conversation with them. A little bit like in the Netflix book saying farm for dissent, right? So don't only go and talk to the people that you think are going to support it. Go and talk to the people who you are fairly sure are going to have a problem with it or may have a problem with it, especially if they've got influence. And here's the thing, you may actually come up with a better solution when you actually go and speak to them. So absolutely do that. And then my final point, just in terms of when you're presenting to a room, like a boardroom or a steering committee or something, is assume nobody's pre-read the papers. So when you present, you know, and in the way that you structure slides and all kinds of things, just kind of keep it at the right level. Just assume nobody's pre-read it, basically. And that was it. That was my summary. So I hope that was of some use. The thing that I would say, how both of those obviously are quite different to when you're trying to get policy approval. Unless you're in a very small company, the chances are that you are not the one that owns the policy as an employee network. And this is really important because I'm not encouraging any ERGs to go and write policy or to go, you know, kind of like circulating policy around and tearing it. Not unless you work at Netflix, right? But assuming that you don't work at Netflix, you probably are not the policy owner. So I would actually, for both of them, I wouldn't start with either my advice or with the Netflix advice. The first piece of advice I would give you is go and speak to the policy owner. Go and speak to the policy owner and actually go and make friends with them. Have several conversations, build a relationship with the policy owner, because actually the policy owner, well, they're called policy owner for a reason, right? They own the policy. They are going to be the ones who are, if they're not rewriting it themselves, they're going to be the ones that are organising the rewriting of the policy. So it's absolutely critical that they are on board because they own that process, right? And if you want some changes to be made, it's probably going to be like a combination of them sort of fronting it with you kind of almost like as the consult, the person that's saying, we think this is a good idea. If you think about it in the typical sort of RACI, like RACI, you know, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, the ERG is like the consult, like the C, rather than, you know, you're definitely not the person that's accountable for that policy, and you're not responsible for it because you're not the owner. So you are the consult. There is an alternative framework for decision making called RAPID, which was produced by Bain and Co., who are management consultants I once worked with many, many years ago. If you want to go and look up that framework for decision making, you can do. But basically, your role is not to kind of like play this lead sort of like main role. You should be supporting the individual that is the policy owner. That's absolutely the first thing that I would say. It's really, really important. Create a really strong relationship with them. And so the other thing as well is getting data and any information that you can, whether it's from members or other sources, etc., to support the positioning of the policy. But all of the other bits, you know, like getting feedback from other places, again, working with the policy owner. So I don't necessarily want you as the ERG co-chair or the lead on this particular initiative, you know, running around the organisation, sort of like as a maverick, sort of creating havoc. That's not what I'm suggesting here. Your role is basically that you are like, you know, working with and consulting and recommending, and maybe you're helping to get data and get a few opinions from, you know, from your ERG members, or helping suggest some questions that might be put out to the wider organisation as well. The other thing that you can do actually in terms of getting approval is, and this is something I'm going to talk about in another video, is seeing whether there are other network co-chairs who might also be interested in changes in the same policy, because then you've kind of got a little bit of strength in numbers as well. So raising these kinds of things at your monthly network co-chairs check-in, which I assume that you have because all good organisations do, and then finding out if somebody else also thinks that their network members might be interested in a change, then it's something that you can work on together and actually spread the workload. So that's it, basically. Those are my tips. If you want more, because I've tried to keep it relatively high level, if you want me to go into more detail, please put some questions in the comments, and I will delve in if that is useful. But yeah, No Rules Rules, great book, but I wouldn't try to follow it verbatim in your organisation if you're trying to make policy change, because you might come a little bit unstuck. And even my own book, great for getting board approval, but at the end of the day, when you are not the policy owner, you really need to take that route through the policy owner rather than trying to do it yourself. So that is it. I hope that was useful. If you have got policy change and policy reviews that you have made happen, please let me know in the comments. And as I say, if you've got any further questions about the how, either put it in the comments or drop me a DM. That's it for today. I will see you on Friday morning for the LinkedIn Live. Ciao.